Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
All right, welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to tackle something that I think we all hear about, but maybe don't fully understand.
Yeah, definitely.
This massive alliance,
Mm,
always in the headlines.
right.
But how does it actually work?
Yeah, a lot of people, I think, see NATO as kind of this mysterious entity. We hear about, treaties and military exercises, but the inner workings, the decision making, that's the stuff that I find really fascinating.
Well, that's what we're here for. This is a deep dive.
Yeah.
And we're going straight to the source today.
Mm-hmm.
We've got a whole bunch of stuff directly from NATO,
Yeah.
their website, their historical documents, even information about how the whole thing was created in the first place.
Wow.
So we're talking
What's this?
founding treaty, funding breakdowns, the whole shebang.
Yeah, and I think for me, we always hear those kind of surface level things, but knowing how NATO is funded, how change actually happens within this massive alliance, I mean, that's key to understanding its power and its limitations.
Okay, so let's just start with the basics. NATO 101. What exactly are we dealing with here?
Well, right on their homepage, NATO defines itself as a political and military alliance of countries from Europe and North America. So right there, we see it's not just a military thing, it's political too. And they are all committed to protecting each other, and I'm quoting here, from any threat. So it's about collective security, having each other's backs.
Protecting each other from any threat.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds pretty intense.
Yeah.
I guess it makes sense considering this whole thing was formed after World War II, right?
Exactly. And that commitment to mutual defense is where we get that very famous Article 5,
Yeah.
the principle of collective defense. I mean, it's the cornerstone of NATO.
Okay, yeah, I've heard of Article 5. Can you break it down like I'm 5?
Sure. Imagine you and your neighbors all agree that if anyone's house gets broken into, everyone calls the cops and helps out.
Okay.
That's basically Article 5. If one NATO member gets attacked, everyone considers it an attack on themselves, and they jump in to help.
Got it. So it's like neighborhood watch, but for countries.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got this massive alliance. It's got all this military might. I imagine it must cost a fortune to run.
Mm-hmm.
Who's footing the bill here? Is it like a giant membership fee that everyone chips into?
Yeah, that's what a lot of people think. But the funding structure is actually a lot more interesting than that. According to NATO's own documents, there isn't one massive NATO fund that everyone's just throwing money into.
Wait, really? So how does it actually work then?
So each country contributes to a shared budget, but the amount each country pays isn't equal. It's based on a formula, things like the country's gross national income.
Hold on. So richer countries are basically footing more of the bill.
That's right. Now, this shared budget covers the basics. The headquarters, the staff, certain joint operations. But here's the thing, the real muscle of NATO, their actual military power, comes from each country's own defense spending.
Wow. See, I had no idea it worked that way. So it's kind of like everyone brings their own tools to the neighborhood watch, but they also all chip in for like snacks and walkie-talkies.
That's a great analogy.
Okay, so if everyone's kind of running their own show militarily, how do they even coordinate?
Mm-hmm.
And how does NATO, actually change over time? This thing's almost 75 years old.
Right. Well, that's where the North Atlantic Treaty comes in. This thing was signed back in 1949. It's basically the rule book. It lays out all the core principles, the obligations, and you can actually read the whole thing on NATO's website,
Oh, wow.
which I highly recommend for anyone who's really curious.
Okay, so we're talking treaties and international law.
Uh-huh.
This sounds a bit heavy, but I am curious. The world has changed a lot since 1949. So how do you even go about updating something as big as the NATO treaty? You can't just, whip out a pen and start making edits.
Oh, you're telling me. Amending the treaty is a huge undertaking. It requires the consent of all member countries. That's 32 countries that all need to agree.
Talk about herding cats.
Right.
So have they managed to make any changes to the treaty with everyone on board?
Well, there haven't been any full rewrites since it was first drafted, but they have added what are called accession protocols as new members join. So think of it as like addendums to the original rule book,
Okay.
making space for the new kids on the block.
Oh, that makes sense. So they're basically keeping the original framework intact, but they're making adjustments as needed.
Right.
That's actually pretty clever, considering they were writing this thing right after World War. Talk about pressure.
Yeah, they knew they had to create something that could stand the test of time. But the fact that it's never been fully rewritten really speaks volumes about how well-crafted the original treaty was.
And how hard it must be to get everyone to agree. But wait, so this treaty is designed to last forever. What if a country decides, hey, we're out?
That's a great question. So according to Article 13, a member can actually withdraw from NATO after 20 years. But here's a fascinating little tidbit. Despite all the debates and disagreements over the years, no country has ever actually left.
Wow, that is fascinating. I guess it really shows how much weight these decisions carry.
Right.
I mean, we're not just talking about leaving a club, we're talking about the security of entire nations. But let's rewind for a second, go back to those initial treaty negotiations. I'm imagining a room full of diplomats just arguing over every word. What were some of the biggest debates they had back then?
Oh, there were plenty of heated discussions. One that stands out is the debate about geographical scope. Article 5, remember, it's all about collective defense, but it only applies to very specific territories. The treaty lays out exactly where those lines are drawn.
Makes sense. You don't want any ambiguity when it comes to something as serious as military intervention. So, were there any surprises in those discussions about where to draw the lines?
You bet. So, for example, France was adamant about including Algeria in the treaty's geographical scope, even though at the time it was still a French colony.
Wait, really? Why would they insist on that?
Well, it caused a big debate. And it really shows how those post-World War II power dynamics were still very much in play, even within an alliance that's supposed to be about cooperation. France, even though they were on the winning side of the war, they were still, holding on to their colonial ambitions.
That's a really good point. It's a reminder that these agreements, even the ones about peace and security, are always influenced by, the political realities of the time. It's not just about ideals, it's also about power and influence.
Exactly. And those historical debates are still relevant today, especially as NATO grapples with questions of expansion. Because adding new members means redrawing those geographical lines, and that always sparks tension. It's like figuring out who's included in the neighborhood watch. And it's not always an easy decision.
That's a perfect segue to our next big question. How does NATO handle modern-day challenges? How have things changed since its founding? And how is the alliance adapting to a world that's vastly different from the one it was born into?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back after a quick message.
As we were saying, the world has changed dramatically since 1949. The Cold War ended, new threats emerged, and the global landscape just keeps shifting. So how does an organization like NATO, with its roots in, a bygone era, stay relevant and effective?
Yeah, they can't just keep doing the same old thing. I mean, it's not like those old Cold War playbooks are going to work against cyber attacks or, climate change.
Exactly. And that's where their strategic concepts come in. Think of these documents as like NATO's evolving game plan. It outlines their big picture goals, their priorities, and how they plan to tackle the most pressing security challenges of the day.
So they're basically updating their strategy based on what's happening in the world.
Exactly.
That's pretty smart. How often do they do that?
So they release a new strategic concept roughly every decade, which allows them to adapt to, the changing times. And the most recent one, from 2022, it highlights some really interesting areas of focus.
Okay, spill the tea. What are they most worried about these days?
Well, collective defense is still at the core, especially with the return of what they call great power competition. Think rising tensions between global superpowers.
I bet what's been happening in Ukraine has really thrown a wrench in things.
Absolutely. The war in Ukraine has been a major wake-up call for NATO, underscoring the importance of deterrence, basically making it clear that an attack would be met with serious consequences and being prepared for a wider range of threats.
What kind of threats are we talking about?
So we're talking hybrid warfare, which is a fancy way of saying conflicts that blend those traditional military tactics with things like cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and economic pressure. It's about messing with a country on multiple fronts, not just on the battlefield.
Wow, that is seriously sneaky. So it's not just about tanks and missiles anymore.
Right. And NATO recognizes that, security is a lot more complex these days. So they're investing in things like, bolstering cyber defenses, strengthening resilience against disinformation, and even working to address climate change as a security risk.
Wait, climate change, that seems a little out of left field for, a military alliance.
It might seem surprising at first, but think about it. Climate change can actually make existing security risks even worse. We're talking resource scarcity, mass migration, and political instability, all of which can lead to conflict. So NATO is trying to be proactive about addressing these potential challenges.
That's pretty forward thinking. But with all these new threats popping up, what about the old ones? Is terrorism still on NATO's radar?
Terrorism is definitely still a major concern. The 2022 strategic concept talks about the importance of continuing the fight against terrorist groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda. They're also focusing on addressing the root causes of terrorism, things like poverty, lack of opportunity, and political oppression.
So it sounds like NATO is juggling a lot right now, from traditional military threats
Mm.
to things like cyber warfare and climate change. How do they even decide what to prioritize? Who's calling the shots?
Well, remember that whole consensus-based decision-making thing we talked about earlier?
Uh-huh.
That applies to everything NATO does, meaning every member country gets a voice, and they all need to sign off on the direction of the alliance.
So there's no, like, supreme leader of NATO who dictates everything.
Do While the Secretary General plays an important role in, leading the alliance and setting the agenda, the big decisions require buy-in from all 32 member states.
That must lead to some interesting debates. I can't even get my family to agree on where to go for dinner.
Exactly. But that's also what makes NATO so unique. It's a truly multilateral organization where everyone, at least in theory, has an equal say. Of course, this can lead to disagreements, and it can definitely slow things down. But it also means that decisions are very carefully considered, and they reflect a wider range of perspectives.
It's kind of like a microcosm of international relations in general, right? You got all these different countries, each with their own interests and priorities, trying to find a way to work together.
Precisely. And in today's world, which is so interconnected, where challenges like terrorism and climate change don't respect borders, that kind of collaborative approach, it's more essential than ever.
So we've covered how NATO is funded, how the treaty can be changed, and how they're grappling with a whole new set of challenges in the 21st century. But I'm still left wondering, what does the future hold for NATO? I mean, is this alliance, which was born out of the ashes of World War II, is it built to last?
That's the million-dollar question. And as with most things in international relations, the answer is complicated. There are definitely some big challenges ahead for NATO, both internal and external, that could shape its future trajectory.
Okay, I'm all ears. What kind of challenges are we talking about?
Well, one of the biggest is the potential for internal division. Remember, we're talking about 32 countries, each with its own history, its own political system, its own national interests. Getting them all on the same page, especially when it comes to tough decisions, it isn't always easy.
Yeah, you can't expect 32 countries to agree on everything.
Yeah.
Are there any specific examples where those internal divisions have caused, friction within NATO?
Definitely. For instance, there have been some pretty strong disagreements over how to handle Russia's increasingly assertive foreign policy. Some members favor a more hawkish approach, pushing for increased military spending and a stronger NATO presence on Russia's borders. Others are more cautious, advocating for dialogue and diplomacy as a way to de-escalate tensions.
It's kind of like that old saying, too many cooks spoil the broth.
Hmm.
But it sounds like they're trying to strike a balance between, standing up to Russia and avoiding a full-blown conflict.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act. And finding that unified strategy that satisfies all 32 members, it's a constant challenge.
So internal divisions are one thing. What about external pressures? Are there any outside forces that could threaten NATO's stability?
Absolutely. And one of the biggest ones looming on the horizon is the rise of China. As China's global influence grows, economically, politically, and militarily, it presents a potential challenge to NATO's traditional role as the world's leading security organization.
So we're talking about a potential power shift on the world stage. I
Right.
mean, that's a big deal. How is NATO responding to that?
They're still figuring that out, to be honest. There's a lot of debate within NATO about how to approach China. Some members see China as a strategic rival, and they advocate for taking a more confrontational stance, pushing back against China's growing influence and building up NATO's military presence in the Asia-Pacific region. Others favor a more cautious approach, focusing on areas of cooperation with China while also addressing, potential security concerns.
It sounds like there's no easy answer.
Hey.
They can't ignore China's rise, but they also don't want to, trigger a new Cold War. It's a tough spot to be in.
You're telling me. And it's not just China. NATO is facing a whole range of external pressures. From the ongoing war in Ukraine, to the threat of terrorism, to the destabilizing effects of climate change. It's a complex and rapidly evolving landscape, and NATO's ability to adapt and stay relevant, that's going to be crucial for its future success.
Okay, so we've got internal divisions, we've got external pressures, and we've got a world that's changing faster than ever. It sounds like NATO is at a crossroads. What do you think, based on everything we've learned today, are some of the key questions that will determine the future of NATO?
Well, I think To loop back to the source material, a few big ones jump out. First, can NATO maintain its unity and cohesion in the face of these challenges? Can they overcome those internal disagreements and present a united front to the world? That's going to be essential if they want to remain a credible force for security.
Right, that whole consensus-based decision-making thing, it can be both a strength and a weakness. It ensures everyone has a voice, but it can also make it hard to act decisively.
Exactly. Second, how will NATO adapt to the changing nature of warfare? As we discussed, it's not just about traditional military might anymore. They need to stay ahead of the curve in areas like cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, and space-based technologies. If they fall behind, they risk becoming obsolete.
It's like they're playing a high-stakes game of chess, but the rules keep changing. What else?
And this brings up another crucial question. What about NATO expansion? Should they continue to add new members, potentially extending their reach right up to Russia's borders? Or will that just provoke more tensions and increase the risk of conflict? That's a debate that's been raging for years, and it's not going away anytime soon.
Wow. So many big questions and no easy answers. But
Yeah.
you've definitely given me a lot to think about.
That's what these deep dives are all about, peeling back the layers, getting beyond the headlines, and really understanding the complexities of these important topics.
Well said. And for our listeners out there, here's something to ponder. As we've seen, the world has changed dramatically since NATO was founded in 1949. What do you think are the biggest challenges facing NATO today? And what steps should they take to address those challenges and ensure their relevance in the 21st century?
Those are questions worth wrestling with. And remember, the information we've explored today, this is just a starting point. There is a wealth of resources out there, historical documents, expert analysis, news coverage, all waiting to be discovered. So keep digging, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep learning.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Until next time, stay curious.
Okay.
Okay, so we've talked about how NATO is funded, how incredibly difficult it is to actually change that treaty, and how the alliance is adapting to a world that's a far cry from the Cold War era. But the big question still remains: can NATO, with its roots in the 20th century, can it really navigate the complexities of the 21st century?
It's a question that has experts and policymakers really scratching their heads. NATO has shown remarkable resilience and adaptability, but whether it can keep pace with the challenges of today's world, well, that's the million-dollar question.
They've definitely got a lot on their plate. We've talked about internal divisions, external pressures, but are there any other factors that could really shake things up for NATO?
Well, here's something that I think is often overlooked: public opinion. NATO's strength ultimately rests on the support of its member countries' populations. If people lose faith in the alliance, if they start questioning its value or its purpose, that could really undermine NATO's legitimacy and effectiveness.
That's a really interesting point. It's one thing for governments to be on board, but if the people aren't behind it, that's a whole other story. What kind of things could erode public support for NATO?
Well, just think about it. If there's a perception that some countries aren't, pulling their weight when it comes to defense spending, that could breed some resentment. Or if NATO gets involved in a protracted conflict with unclear objectives or, God forbid, high casualties, that could lead to war fatigue and a decline in public support.
So it's not just about military strategy and diplomacy. It's about hearts and minds as well. NATO needs to make the case to its citizens that it's still relevant, that it's worth investing in, that it truly serves their interests.
Absolutely. And that's no easy feat in today's world where information is just constantly flowing. Misinformation spreads like wildfire, and public opinion can just shift on a dime.
That makes sense. It's like they're constantly trying to stay one step ahead of the game, both on the battlefield and in the court of public opinion.
Precisely. They need to be nimble, adaptable, and constantly evolving to meet the challenges of a world that's increasingly complex and interconnected.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into NATO. We've covered a lot of ground, from the nuts and bolts of how the alliance works to those big picture questions about its future. What are your final thoughts on NATO's prospects?
If we look back at everything we've discussed, I think it's safe to say that NATO is facing a pretty pivotal moment in its history. The decisions it makes in the coming years, both internally and in response to those external pressures, those are going to determine whether it can continue to be a force for stability and security in the 21st century.
It's been fascinating to learn about all the different factors that are at play here. I mean, it's way more intricate than that I ever imagined.
That's the beauty of these deep dives. They remind us that there's always more to learn, even about topics we think we understand. And often the most interesting stuff is hidden beneath the surface.
Well said. And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity about NATO and the challenges it faces. Remember, the resources we've explored today, those are just a starting point. There's a whole world of information out there just waiting to be discovered. So keep digging, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep learning.
Until next time, stay curious.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.